All right. Hello and welcome back to the Futurism at JHU podcast. I'm your host, Nicholas, and today joined with a very special guest, President Ronald Daniels. So many of you already know him, but to give him a quick introduction, Ron Daniels has served as the 14th president of Johns Hopkins University since 2009. Under his leadership, Johns Hopkins has firmly cemented its preeminence in education, patient care, and innovative discovery, and has furthered its long tradition of research excellence. He has also deepened the university's commitment to the city of Baltimore and enhanced student access through historic investments in financial aid. His book, What Universities Owe Democracy, is a powerful reminder of the fragile experiment that is American liberal democracy, and poses the question of not what has democracy done for universities, but what universities should do for democracy. So, Ron, or President Daniels, I should say.
You can call me Ron. It's good.
Okay.
And it's, Nicholas, it's great to be here and really thrilled to finally be able to have this conversation with you around the book. So Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to have you on. To give you, the listeners a little backstory, actually, we met a couple years ago and
Masked,
distanced. Masked and distanced.
Right.
And
but nevertheless engaged.
Nevertheless engaged. And President Daniels was gracious enough to, meet me and, ask a little bit about me. And I got to get a copy of his book, signed copy, I must say. So this is a treasured part of my, book collection. So this has been a couple years in the making. Very excited this is happening in, our last semester. What a way to go out. So just to start, I was curious. I know this was around 2021 that you published this book. I know there's a lot that's been going on in American history. Obviously, there was the insurrection on January 6th. So I was curious if that or, other events inspired this book.
So it's a great question, Nicholas. I think for me, it starts off with a sense of both within the United States and indeed internationally, the assumption that there was an inexorable movement towards the adoption of liberal democracy. And from reading the book, when I refer to liberal democracy, I'm referring to a specific arrangement of political affairs, namely where you do have majority rule that is determined by regularly scheduled and accountable, transparent elections. But nevertheless, there's also, in the conception of liberal democracy, there's constraints on what elected officials who are responsive to the majority can do. And in particular, there is protection for individual rights. So this idea of liberal democracy is one in which the people rule, but subject to constraints around how power, particularly public power, is exercised vis-a-vis individual rights, minority groups, and so forth. So for me, for I think many years, there's a sense that one could just see a steady march towards the adoption of democracy across the world. And the sense was that as citizens within countries become more affluent, there'll be a consequent demand for democratic institutions with the kind of accountabilities I was talking about. And it's just inexorable. This march is inexorable, inevitable, and we could just sort of assume that more countries would come into the fold of democracies. And more than that, that the democratic experiment that we know well in the United States and indeed in my home country in Canada, but indeed within Western Europe and so forth, these arrangements were solid. Democracies were going to only become stronger. And that was sort of the trajectory we're on. And I think what we've seen over the last several years is the extent to which democracy seems much more fragile than we ever imagined. First and foremost, on a global scale, rather than seeing things as I had thought would be the case, that there'd be more and more countries coming into the democratic fold, we've actually seen just the opposite. And the Varieties of Democracies Institute that tracks us has seen, the share over the last decade of countries or people in countries that are democracies drop from about 54% of the world's population in basically living in democracies to under 30%, something in the order of 28%. So first and foremost, the sense that the momentum was all in the direction of democracy. Turns out not to be true. And then, of course, captured most vividly around the tragic events of January 6th. We also see within our own country, the institutions, the norms around democracy seem to be more fragile than we had ever realized. So essentially, what motivated this book was just a sense that with democracy being more fragile, with real concerns about its durability, I wanted to ask the question of universities. How important are we for the democratic experiment? And if it turns out that we are implicated in some ways in supporting democratic flourishing, how well are we doing in supporting this experiment? And to the extent that we're falling short, are there things that we could do differently to bolster our capacity to support, nourish, encourage the strengthening of democracy? And it was that exercise that really led to the book, where obviously I have thoughts on how we're doing and what we could do better.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that. I guess kind of pivoting to the next question after that, what would you say is like your core message of the book? Like, what do universities owe democracy?
So I think first and foremost, that democracies require strong universities, that I believe just in the way that we think about independent media, legislatures that are regularly elected, are accountable to the public, that these are institutions we all see as critical for democracy. So too do I think the university is a critical institution for democracy. Indeed, I believe it's an indispensable institution for democracy. And you'll know from the book that I make that claim around four basic ideas. One, that we're implicated in promoting ideas of social mobility, and that's really important for maintaining and indeed enhancing faith in the democratic experiment, that people can transcend their circumstances if they've got the ambition and the capability to do that. Secondly, that we are really an important institution in educating for democracy, that we help transmit awareness of the institutions, the history of democracy, how we are doing, how we're not doing, how we can do better, and that's, again, another important role that universities play. Thirdly, that universities are a critical institution for democracy because of the way in which we add to knowledge, the way that we scrutinize claims to fact by people, particularly who hold political office, and that we're an important institution for checking facts, for certifying claims to truth. And again, that's something that we work with media and other institutions in discharging that role, but we're critical in that function. And then finally, that universities are really important sites for modeling pluralism. And to the extent that we are, particularly in this country, increasingly divided into camps or tribes of Republicans and Democrats, and organizing our social and political lives in those tribes, we've lost the power, I think, to talk to each other and across difference. And it seems to me that universities represent really important sites where that can happen. So in all those ways, I think we're very important for democracy, and we discharge those responsibilities in a manner that makes us indispensable.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. Like, as a college student for the past few years, I've always thought of like universities as like a safe space where I can kind of talk with people from different backgrounds. I think Hopkins in particular does a good job of creating a very diverse community. Like, I know compared to a lot of my friends in other colleges, it's less diverse communities, not just, ethnically, racially, but also in thought and things like that. So I do think that, personally from, my experience, that Hopkins has done a good job of that.
I think on that, Nicholas, and it's just worth emphasizing that it's not just enough to create those communities of diversity. And I think that's something that for the last decade or two, there was this increasing increasing sensitivity to the importance of ensuring that there's a greater diversity of backgrounds, of viewpoints, and so forth represented in our student bodies. And so we focus on accessibility. But what I think we failed to do was to think about, once you've got these incredibly interesting, diverse populations on the campus, then what happens? It's not just enough to bring people to the university. You've got to think about how you foster the engagements, the interactions, the conversations that make sense of that diversity. And again, I think that's an area where we've been falling short.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I think, just like thinking from my experience, the things that have maybe been that Hopkins has done well, I think one is Hopkins votes. Like I've personally, so I'm a neuroscience major, so I'm very much like interested in the brain and thinking about psychology and, kind of unlocking the secrets there. I don't think about politics that much, but I think organizations like Hopkins Votes, which are trying to promote civil dialogue or civic dialogue and thinking about how can we be engaged, citizens, of this democracy, I think are super important. Actually, I want to say our third episode of the Futurism podcast was actually on civic engagement. It was by one of my friends, Kristen Corley, and she talked about this app that basically allowed voters in Mexico to get like a concise view of what their politicians were, voting on and saying, and so they can make a more informed decision. So I think things like that, where we can kind of implement technology and also just create a greater kind of sense of like, we're all in this together, if that makes sense. Like at Hopkins, where I love when Hopkins Votes is out on the breezeway and they're like, come, get your stickers and your shirt. Like I have a Hopkins Votes shirt and, make sure you signed up to vote. Like it's definitely made me more aware. And I think awareness is the first step in becoming more engaged.
I agree with you. And I think as you describe all the ways in which once you have a sensitivity to the importance of voting as an exercise of responsible citizenship, then it opens up to all sorts of other ways of participating in the political process. But I think to your point, and it's borne out in the empirical literature, by and large, folks who are interested in STEM-related fields participate less in the political process than those students who, for instance, will veer to the social sciences and humanities. And it's even at the simplest level of, will you vote? And will you register to vote? And so again, the success that Hopkins Votes has had in the last 6 years, six to 8 years, the very significant increase in voter turnout that they've been able to affect, and in particular, getting students in STEM-related fields to register and to vote has been remarkable. It's a dramatic transformation that has taken place under the aegis of that student-led initiative. And we're really proud of it.
Yeah. No, I was just reading on your website earlier today. I think the stat was something from like 2016, like 40% around of Hopkins students were voting, and now it's like 70-75%.
It's
so
amazing.
That's
and
amazing.
And that's and that was a midterm election that you saw a significant increase from a national election, so a presidential election, I should say. So it really signifies a much greater consciousness of this responsibility that, again, I think is about student leadership. So it's a wonderful tribute to all the efforts that have been made there by our students.
Yeah, and I think that's really the core of our democracy, right? Is like the ability to vote. Because if you look at other countries, like let's say Russia, China, the more autocratic countries, some of them may hold votes, but we all know it's not really a truly, democratic system. And so I think that's one of the beauties of, the United States and other democratic countries. I always think about this because I'm, of Greek heritage. So I always think back to the ancient Greeks, the original democracy. And I know there's SNF Agora, and Agora, in Greek is kind of like marketplaces where people meet, where people talk. And so, when I think about democracy, I always think back to that direct democracy that the Greeks had. And obviously we don't quite have that. We have a more representative democracy, but I still think the vote is what makes the United States and again, other democratic countries so unique is that, and people say this whole time, oh, my vote doesn't count. But then if everyone thinks that way, what does that do?
Right.
If you look at the last, few elections, it's like, and I'm making up a statistic here, but something like 50% of Americans don't vote. And it's like, what if that other 50% had, or 40%, whatever it is? I think it's definitely a dangerous kind of thought where people think, oh, my vote does not matter, because it truly does. Because
and there's elections, again, where you can see increasingly, just given how tight the margins are within particularly presidential elections, but to see that it all boils down to 3 states, which are the swing states, and it's literally less than 100,000 voters that can determine the outcome of a presidential election. And of course, go back to Bush and Gore, and again, it was 1 state, and it was just a ridiculously small number of votes that determined the outcome of the election. So you never know when you're going to be really consequential. But I think more than that, I think it's a habit that's really important in terms of reminding ourselves that we are the principles of a democracy. The politicians are elected. Our elected politicians are ultimately just our agents, that they're accountable back to us. And the way in which, first and foremost, we register our approval or opprobrium for the way in which they have operated is through the exercise of the vote. So I think it's fundamental to everything else that informed and engaged citizens need to do in terms of discharging their responsibilities for democracy. But the thought that you could, for instance, be really active in a host of community organizations, you could be involved in assistance to certain groups, neighborhoods in need, but not exercise the basic franchise for voting is really paradoxical to me. And that's why, again, I think this is a fundamental responsibility that is really at the centerpiece of democratic participation and citizenship.
Definitely. And just kind of like an interesting story. A few weeks back, I got to visit the new Bloomberg Center in DC, and also went by the Capitol, and was fortunate enough through kind of a family friend connection to see one of the speaker votes. I think it was the one right before they finally went through with the whole speaker vote. And I think no matter what side of the aisle you're on, just like being able to like sit there and like see that happening live, I think it was such an interesting experience. And I was like, wow, like this is the room where it happens. Like legislation goes through and people are voting. And for me being, really a scientist and not really thinking about the politics of just society in general, it was definitely an illuminating experience. And I think one that has made me want to become more kind of at least politically aware, like keeping up with the news, keeping up with what's going on in politics, and just like trying to have more, obviously civil political discussions with, people of all different backgrounds.
And I would just say, particularly for the interest that you have, like in neuroscience, for instance, there are so many critical issues that politicians will ultimately be responsible for in terms of how you think about the approval of therapies designed to assist, augment in some meaningful way neurological capability. How you think about the appropriateness of genetic engineering, its risks and rewards, how you think about artificial intelligence and the extent to which you can imbue computers with capabilities that have hitherto really been thought to be quintessentially human. I mean, all of these questions raise really important, vexing concerns for scientists. And it's inconceivable that you folks that have significant domain expertise wouldn't be central to that conversation. So that's why I think it's again, it goes back to Hopkins with its strong STEM orientation. It's so important that this project around enhancing awareness of the importance of democratic institutions and democratic citizenship be be something that we're all conscious of here.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Like there's definitely a lot of lack of scientific expertise, I think, kind of from a political standpoint. Um, Actually, when I was there, I sat in on a couple committees. One was on immigration, and another one was on artificial intelligence. And I got to see a few testimonials from experts in their field. So I do like that at least politicians are hosting these events where you can actually listen to the experts and get their expert opinion. I think that's very important. But I also think that kind of the lack of scientific trust. I mean, we've seen this in the pandemic. Like, there's a lot of distrust around science, and I think it goes even beyond science. It's just distrust in general. Like, people just do not trust information anymore. And this was actually, again, one of our episodes, I think number 26. It was Truth and Misinformation, and we talked about how social media in particular has kind of like propagated this so many like misinformation campaigns. Like, I remember at the start of the pandemic, and this is embarrassing to say, I kind of fell for it. There was this whole campaign around, oh, masks aren't effective because basically like the particles can go like through the sides of the mask. And I was like, that seems reasonable. And then I like read into it more and I was like, wait, like that's total BS. So I think being like skeptical of when there's like a big kind of event going on, like we've had a couple of huge crises in the past couple of years, in Europe, in the Middle East. And I think people kind of jump straight to one conclusion when they hear something. And I think being skeptical of what you're hearing is like super important because there's a lot of misinformation going around. Right. But at the same time, when there's science involved, when there's experts who are giving like sound, evidence-based reasoning, I think it's important on the flip side to trust that. So like there's this balance between not blindly trusting things, but then also trusting the people who actually are making, sound, scientific, evidence-based, arguments. It's kind of this like tricky situation because people are just on one side or the other, and it's very hard to find that happy medium.
But I think this is where we, particularly faculty at the university, have to understand that skepticism that people have to claims to truth or accuracy, and we really in our published research have to be particularly attentive to how we support the claims that we're making. You'll know that one of the things that I worry a lot about in the book is the reproducibility crisis, which has affected a number of different areas of science, including the social sciences, where work is published, but ultimately it's not reproducible when other scholars try and reproduce the findings. Here, to your point, if you really want the university and university scholars to be able to persuade the communities of which they're part that they really are accurate, careful, they have robust claims to truthfulness, that you've got to be, careful that we can substantiate the claims that we make, and that we're able to support the claims that we make with our data sets, with essentially the rough work that we've done in support of those claims. And to the extent that we can't do that or don't do that, then I think it actually exacerbates the problem that you're describing, which is that people are just naturally skeptical of these claims. And if we can't, on the basis of our standing as a serious and brave research institution, if affiliation with that in itself is not going to carry the day and people are going to be skeptical of that, then I think, again, you really worry about our capacity to resolve fundamental questions, differences within our contemporary political discourse. I often say that, as we know, that we're a deeply divided country right now in the way that I described earlier. But when people are deeply divided, I often wonder whether they're divided because they have fundamentally different values that are separating them, or they have fundamentally different views about sort of the empirical state of the world that they are using in their advocacy. And if it turns out that it's the latter, then this is resolvable by going to sources that one can be confident are rigorous, robust, that the data are good, that the reasons that are made on the basis of those data are defensible. And if that holds together, then that's another way in which you can hopefully attenuate some of the conflict that we see now.
Yeah. I think regardless, the fact that, and I see this so often on social media where people refuse to even acknowledge like the other side's just opinion is, I think, a little bit frightening because like you don't have to agree. I think that's the fundamental nature of democracy is we can have arguments, we can have disagreements. Right. I think that's the beauty of it is that you can disagree. If you look at other countries, you disagree, you get put in jail or worse. Here, you can disagree and people say, okay. But I think, again, people should be able to have civil arguments and try at least to see the other side's
and to
view.
narrow and to figure out what it is that you're really disputing.
Exactly.
And to narrow the difference. If it turns out that you have fundamentally different values, and again, that's an important feature of liberal democracy. It accepts that there isn't a central truth that we all have to have the same values. It accepts that there are different values and interests at play and tries to reconcile them, and that we agree to live with each other, knowing that we may have different worldviews, but nevertheless, we have a shared interest in making our community, our country work. So even where you have different values, it's again conceivable through a spirit of compromise and consensus building that you can actually function effectively. But it's that much more compelling when you actually have the same values, but you have actually different, just fundamentally different views of, is climate change man-made, or is it reflect some other set of forces that are beyond our control? If we can determine that, that has real implications for how we think about policy. And those are knowable things that interrogation, examination, verification can help us get to a more accurate sense of the true state of affairs. So again, I think this is where, however you define what it is that separates us, I actually think there's a lot in the nature of the democratic experiment that still gives us reason for hope that we can figure this out together. But again, it goes back to places like Hopkins. We have a really important role in narrowing those differences and giving people the capacity to work through those differences and to understand the techniques of how you manage that kind of conflict.
Yeah. And on that note of Hopkins, I did want to ask you about kind of two of the more recent decisions that were made. One, getting rid of legacy admissions, and the other, getting rid of people choosing their first-year roommates. I was kind of curious, what was the kind of rationale behind those two decisions?
So both of them actually were decisions that I think quite naturally flowed from the claims that I made in the book. The first one, ending legacy admissions, was tied to the premium that I think democracy places, appropriately so, on social mobility. The idea that at our best, we create conditions of equal opportunity where people who are meritorious, who have ambition, who have the discipline, are the ones that will be able to get ahead in our society. And, to my mind, knowing how competitive it is to get into a university like Johns Hopkins, to the extent that we say we stand fundamentally for the idea of equal opportunity, we're going to decide this purely on the merits. And that's going to be our approach to how we think about selecting a class. And then to say, oh, but wait a second, we're going to actually put our thumb on the scales for people who have some kind of affiliation to Johns Hopkins, because we think this is important to perpetuate the kind of community that we've always been. and that we should privilege that kind of experience. And to my mind, that's an idea that's deeply antithetical to the notion of a merit-based process for constructing a class. That is, my wife likes to say that legacy admissions basically reflect a way of providing affirmative action to students who have had every advantage in life. They've come from families that are affluent, that are stable. They've grown up in neighborhoods that are typically safer, stronger than other neighborhoods that people grow up in. They've had advantages in the schools they've gone to, the summer experiences they've had. And to say that at the end of the day, they have all those advantages, and then at the time that you're applying for a university, we say, well, one more time, we're going to put the thumb on the scales for these folks. And that, to my mind, is a way of perpetuating inherited privilege rather than honoring the idea of equal opportunity, which I think is really a fundamental principle that has guided this country in the past. So that's the reason why we decided to end legacy admissions. And we still, I'm really pleased that we still have students here who have a connection to the university through their parents or grandparents. But the critical thing is they've gotten in solely on the basis of their own merits. It doesn't reflect an institutional advantage that has been systematically conferred on them by virtue of their status. So that's on legacy admissions. The decision to end the ability of students to choose their roommates was related to the ideas of purposeful pluralism that we develop in the book. And here it goes to, I think, a very simple idea and builds on what we discussed earlier, that we've got these incredibly diverse classes. And what you want to ensure is that there's real opportunities for people learning, living with, negotiating across the differences that define us. And to my mind, one of the most powerful ways that happens is with the first year roommate or roommates that you get. And not surprisingly, over the last several decades, there's been a drift away from universities randomly assigning students to dorm rooms and instead letting students choose who their roommates will be. And surprise, surprise, when you give students the capacity to choose their roommates, typically what they do is, and it's a natural human instinct, they look for people who kind of are similar to them, similar backgrounds, similar political orientation, similar worldviews. And that's a lost opportunity. And so to the extent that what we're trying to do in the 4 years that students are in this very intense undergraduate experience, and you're being forced to confront differences in a way that you never have before, and in very tight quarters, in classes and extracurricular activities, in dorm rooms, in our various food venues and so forth. I think that that's that reality of of being able to experience this incredible and dynamic diversity is undermined when you take the rooming piece out of the equation, and it sort of sets the stage, I think, for replicating a lot of the ways in which we know we live now as Americans. The term that's often used is the great sort, the geographic sort, that we're actually seeing that, again, Dems live, work, get educated within communities, again, characterized typically by concentrated on the coast. And then you have the so-called flyover zones where Republicans live. And to the extent that students come from those communities and come to a place like Hopkins and replicate those same patterns by selecting their roommates, you've lost an opportunity. So this is, again, something where we in academic leadership, along with the trustees, ultimately thought, that if we're really serious about trying to promote this idea of dynamic pluralism, we should start with the with removing the choice of first year roommates and go back to the old way, which was random assignment.
Cool. Well, thank you for sharing that. My final question for you is, so I'm a neuroscience major, so I'm really a student of career arts and sciences, but so many of the incredible opportunities I've had have been through the Whiting School of Engineering, through the Center for Leadership Education. I've done a couple minors through there, and they've been incredibly useful in their network. And then, of course, the Center for Learning, Design, and Technology. And, having this incredible podcasting team, helping with all the behind the scenes and this amazing studio, making this all happen. So I was curious, what do you kind of see as the role of engineering programs specifically in kind of, promoting democracy and, all these ideals that we've kind of discussed?
Well, I just think there's so many ways in which the capabilities, the knowledge that engineers have just become absolutely critical to our democratic experiment. At one level, I think so many of the most interesting questions that we're going to confront as a society ultimately are going to call on engineering expertise to be able to make sense of these issues. So, when we think about the debates that are underway now around the role of artificial intelligence, how it should be regulated, whether this is something that ultimately should be left to the private sector to decide on its own, or whether it needs significant government overlay. Does it require a coordinated national collaboration to be able to appropriately regulate and ensure that we get the benefits, but not some of the really sinister downsides that people worry about from artificial intelligence? I mean, this is ultimately something where we really do need the domain expertise of engineers. And I could replicate that across so many different fields where our students are really the subject experts that we need to draw on the conversation. At another level, I think in so many different areas of democratic life these days, going from how we vote, how we verify voting, the fact that you still, in many jurisdictions, you have to either go in person and vote, or you have to mail in a ballot. The fact that we can't do this electronically, and the way that, there's so many methods of verification for when we do things over the internet, reflects to me a very, I think, an antiquated conception of the way we should be able to exercise our franchise. How you develop techniques around that ultimately requires engineering. How you think about, the incredible opportunities to dramatically improve the delivery of public services, and to what extent you can rely on more online delivery for a range of different services that are typically provided by governments. Again, we're going to need engineers to be able to design these mechanisms, and so I think engineers are front and center in so many different ways for the challenges that we are facing as a society, and the opportunities. And I think that's good reason for you having spent the amount of time that you did with folks over in the Whiting School. It's a good compliment to your experience here.
And I will say, all of my podcast co-founders are engineers, so I think having that perspective from more science background has been invaluable, and kind of, having this, the strong engineering background. I mean, think about it, engineers really built society, right? Like everything around us that's working right now, it's all the work of engineers.
And I would just add one last piece of this, which is, when I think about the prospects for Baltimore and how we can make this city stronger, ultimately what this city, which has suffered significant decline in working population, what it requires is new businesses, new industries to replace the ones that 50 years ago were so dominant. General Motors, Bethlehem Steel, a host of other classic manufacturing companies. To my mind, it's going to be to the engineers in particular who graduate from Hopkins, I hope, who many of whom will stay here and bring their startup ideas to this environment that will ultimately allow us to bring new sources of employment, of tax revenue to the city, which ultimately is part of the way in which you ensure that democracy is flourishing. That is, you need economic growth and development to be able to support a strong state with the capacity to build strong services and institutions around it. And so again, that requires innovation. And I look to our graduates from Whiting to help us pull that off.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing that. Again, thank you for coming on the podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you. If you would like to check out President Daniels' book, I have it right here. Here's my copy.
It's a free download. One of the things, because we had talked a lot about when we published the book, about the importance of making ideas accessible. The folks at the Johns Hopkins University Press felt it was important that we actually make this available through free download, and so you don't have to buy the book. You can get it on the internet and just go to the JHU Press site for those who are interested.
Yeah, so check it out. I've read both I have the physical book, which I like the physical book personally. So if you want to get a physical book, it's available anywhere you buy books, Amazon, Barnes & Noble's, JHU Press website.
Remainder bins everywhere.
Yeah,
so,
but like somewhere. President Daniels said, also on Project Muse online. And we'll include links to all of this in the show notes. So
terrific.
Definitely a worthy read. I really enjoyed it. Congrats on the book again.
Nicholas, thank you so much for hosting me. And thanks for the work that you've done here at Hopkins and for the Futurism podcast. It's terrific, the initiative and leadership you've shown. And just really, really pleased that you were here at Hopkins. I know you're soon to graduate, and just wish you all the best in the next stage of your career.
Thank you so much. All the best.
Thank you.